system, because when we use water domestically, it goes back, usually in the drainage, and we can use it again and again. When agriculture uses it, it disappears into the atmosphere, and we have to wait for it to come back in the hydrological cycle. And I thought I'd just throw a couple of numbers at you. Uma threw quite a lot today, but a typical European diet here in Europe probably consumes 3,500 litres of water every day. That's an enormous amount of water compared with domestic demand, which is about 140 litres. So 3,500 litres per person per day. The figures quoted for the US are a little bit bigger than that. It's 5,000 litres per person per day. And so we suspect you may have a richer water diet than we do here in Europe. And if you go to the developing countries, it's down to about 1,000 litres per person per day. So you can see the differences in terms of the potential for food production and nutrition and so on. For me, water for food is the elephant in the room. We all know it's there, but it doesn't get discussed too much politically because of the politics of water. And the FAO is trying its best among lots of other people to put this massive amount of water in agriculture up there, because if we're going to start running out of water, and it is limiting, then agriculture could be the place we could begin to save water and provide the supplies that other people need. I think I would say that water, it's important to know that water is a limiting resource and not necessarily a finite resource. We tend to think of a finite resource, but it's not finite in the way that fossil fuels are finite. Water renews every year, most years anyway. We hope it does, but it's a limiting resource. And the thing that limits everything is our ability to catch it, store it, and use it in a wise sort of way. And if we don't get it right one year, there's a chance we can do it the next year and so on. So the limit is not necessarily the lack of water. It's our ability to use that supply in a sort of sensible way. And just another statistic rounding up, which I think might be relevant to people in the Western states. Almond milk is something which is quite fashionable here in the UK at the moment. And it takes 74 litres of water to produce a single glass of almond milk. And producing it in a desert climate, to me, just doesn't seem quite right. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Melvyn. So shifting over to Nicole Lafour, who is the director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for small-scale irrigation. And I think Melvyn queued up really well too. So her background is actually in government and political theory, so has a lot of expertise and insight on that. Nicole?
Yeah, thanks. And agreed, it's a good segue into some of the points that I would like to make. As Emily said, I am the director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab on small-scale irrigation. It's a USAID and US government program based out of the Borlaug Institute at Texas A&M University. And I do have a social science background, development, policy, political science, particularly looking at challenging contexts and looking at conflict over natural resources. I have lived and worked primarily in sub-Saharan Africa for the last couple of decades plus. And I've done some work in Southeast Asia as well. But my primary focus is really in developing contexts and in fragile states and developing markets. And given my background, I'm going to throw out not statistics, but just pose a couple of questions. One of the questions is really that given all of those big and wicked problems that we have in terms of agriculture and in terms of water, why focus on women and resource poor farmers? We already see young, better off male farmers investing in water resources on farm. They're improving productivity. raising yields. So why bother? If the aim is productivity, then we're achieving that through some of these means that are already underway. And it's also really, really difficult. Women and resource-poor farmers are constrained in many ways compared to other farmers. They don't have as great access to credit. They have higher investment costs. They have lower access to labor, less time. There's a big issue of time poverty with women farmers and resource-poor farmers. And they often are not as well integrated into markets. They also tend to be excluded from the few governance mechanisms that exist for managing water at local level. So if we have all of these constraints and difficulties, then why is there discussions about this? Why not just aim for higher yields through whatever means possible? So I just wanted to offer a couple of thoughts on this to get going today. One of those is that as we see a decline in access to natural resources, whether it's water or increasingly with qualities of soil, we also are worsening equity. So we're actually creating inequality through increased contests over natural resources. And as that occurs, we see an overall increase in inequality. So what we're essentially doing by not trying to deal with equity up front is we're inadvertently making inequality worse. And this may also be making water access more difficult for women and resource-poor farmers for other uses, for domestic uses and other purposes. So that is one of the unintended consequences of not addressing equity issues. A second point to consider is that as natural resources and water are increasingly under pressure, we need to be thinking more in terms of nutritional outcomes and not just in terms of productivity and yield. So we may need to consider how we direct water to reduce stunting and wasting, to look at the changing diets, particularly as we urbanize more and more. And so maybe we need to be actually thinking about nutritional security and nutrition sensitive water investments, and not thinking about water investments that are just about increased efficiency or increased productivity. And one of the things that we know is that women play very important roles in nutritional security. This occurs through many pathways. It's through income pathways by increasing women's income. It's through consumption and productive pathways. It's also through WASH and women's empowerment. So we see multiple pathways through which women can really move the dial on nutritional security. So my suggestion is to begin to think in terms of nutritional security and not just food security. That is my main couple of messages to get started. And it's just to sort of pose questions to my fellow panelists, but also putting those out as questions to the wider audience. And with that, I will hand back over.
Great, thank you so much, Nicole. Next, I'd like to introduce Martin Passman, who is the president of Valmont Industries in Argentina, and also a farmer himself, coming from multiple generations of farmers.
Thank you, Emily. Well, I am an agricultural engineer from Argentina. I'm involved for the last 30 years in farming and in irrigation. And what type of irrigation I like? I have passion in trying to transform improductive land into high productivity land with center pivot irrigation. I am 5th generation of farmers. And for me, what it is a farmer, what I am, what I do, what I like to say that through my crops, I capture solar energy through the leaves. I capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from the air. I borrow water from the water cycle. I use the nutrients from the soil and from the air. with all that, I produce food. I produce food to feed this increasing population that we are all living in this global. By the byproduct, how I do this? Well, mostly under irrigation and also in no-tillage farming. What it is no-tillage? No-tillage farming, it is to plant the corn, to sow the wheat, to do all the crops without laboring the soil, without a plow, without a disc. So with this, all the residues of the crop that at the end, it is carbon dioxide that the crop was capturing from the air, I introduce that into the soil, on top of the soil, and that during the time it is transformed in organic matter, in what we know humus. So in this way, I improve the quality of my soils. It's a virtual cycle where I am doing two things. So at my farm, I am producing food, and on the other side, I am mitigating the problem of carbon dioxide in the world by capturing all that in a no-tillage way. That's why when we think that we have to increase the food productions by 60% from now to 2050, I think that the farmers all around the globe, we can do a lot to this if we can put in practice the techniques that we are having today in some countries and all that. I would say mostly South America today, it is no-tillage farming. Argentina, it is 90% no-tillage farming. Having said that, it is, well, what will happen with water? As an agronomist that worked with 30 years in irrigation, what I said it is, today around more than 90% of the world use of water, it is flood irrigation. We can say that today 40% of the food, it is produced under 17-18% of the area that it is with that, mostly that flood irrigation. So we have a huge gap to improve efficiency in irrigation. We have a huge gap if we go to a system that have 80%, 90%, 97%, like it may be a drip, or 90% that it is a center pivot. We can have enough water for using in agriculture and to leave water for other industries or for urban places. So this is my introduction, and then I open for the questions. Thank you, Emily.
Great. And so our last panelist is Samir Ibrahim, who is the CEO and founder of Sun Culture, which sells solar-powered drip irrigation systems to farmers in Kenya, and the recipient of multiple awards for that work. Samir.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to everyone at MIT Water for organizing this amazing panel. I first want to acknowledge all my co-panelists. Melvyn, I think you give David Attenborough a run for his money. So thank you for doing that for everyone in irrigation. Nicole, you made an amazing point about women. I don't think so many people know that women make up 43% of the agricultural labor force, and they're responsible for an overwhelming majority, 90% of household food preparation. And as you said, they often lack necessary information, resources, and support. And if they had those things, as many as 150 million people 150 million fewer people would go hungry every night. So thank you for those comments. And Martin, I commend no-tillage farming. It's really hard. So thank you for bringing that in. I think one of the challenge for topics like this is that everything we do is so important, and the audience is going to hear all of these amazing ideas and amazing challenges. But these are very big challenges, and as humans, we're not necessarily designed to think about these challenges in such a big way. So my hope from this panel is that we all address the challenges when it comes to food security, resource management, equity amongst everyone with the same vigor and rigor that we approach this pandemic. So my goal is that everyone kind of has a sense of urgency leaving this. Very quickly, my name is Samir Ibrahim, like Emily said. I started Africa's first solar irrigation company. We're now the largest distributor of solar water pumps for off-grid farmers on the continent. We work in Kenya and we distribute in a number of different markets in both East and West Africa. Our model is that we make, sell, service, and finance solar-powered irrigation systems. So we install a system for a farmer. We add services like installation and training and ongoing support. And then our farmers pay us back over 30 months. So it's a pay-as-you-grow model is what we say. Our farmers are able to increase their yields by anywhere from 50% to 300%, increase their incomes by up to 5 times. And one of the most encouraging pieces of data that we just got a couple weeks ago is that during the coronavirus pandemic, 87% of Kenyan farmers reported that they made less money over the last couple of quarters, while over 80% of our farmers reported increase in their incomes. And this isn't to say that Sun Culture is doing this, but this is just, so if you know me, one of my big messages is that technology exists to solve a lot of these problems. And what's really missing, in my view, amongst what all of us are talking about, is financing, because money can help shape incentives. And if we can figure out how to focus and corral financing and point it in the direction of a few incentives versus a spray and pray approach that we've had to take over the last decade to see what works, I think we can start moving the needle for all of the challenges that we're speaking about. So I'm excited to dig into this a bit more.
Great, thank you all. So I'm going to kick us off with the first question that I think a number of you have touched on, which is this relationship between irrigation and water and yields. And I think often this conversation is contextualized really talking about fertilizer and how there's this yield gap that we need to work on closing. And so I wanted to kind of explicitly ask all of you, how critical is water in this yield gap? And I think also addressing the duality of, are we using enough water for agriculture or are we using too much? There seems to be a kind of tension there. And I think in particular to you, Nicole, also thinking about whether conceptualizing of water's role in this for the yield gap, is that even the right way to be thinking about this? Should we be adding more nuance with respect to nutrition? So again, I think my goal here is to delve a little bit more into what really is the most condensed version of this problem and water's role in it that we can get to, understanding that there is a lot of really critical nuance here.
So who do you want to kick
Go ahead,
off
Melvyn.
Well, I mean, I could just give us a simple scientific perspective. The relationship between crop growth, production, and water is a very well-known curve. And up to a certain point, the more water you add, the more yield you get. And the water is the means by which nutrients are translocated from the soil into the roots and into the plant. Therefore, it is the fluid that brings the nutrients in as well. And so the two together is often the critical issue. Water without nutrients is not much good. Nutrients without water is a disaster. So you need both. And reducing the amount of water that you put into the plant will reduce the yield. And so when we're looking to reduce water, we can often think about saving water that is otherwise being wasted rather than cutting down on the water that's needed for evapotranspiration. It's simple science in a way, and we mustn't forget the basic physics when we're thinking about what's going on.
And so I think then either Martine or Samir, I know there's a lot of geographical variation with respect to where we are really low on water and irrigation needs. Can either of you comment on where the areas are, where we're in that area that Melvyn just described of not having enough water to complement the nutrition that the plants are receiving?
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at that to start. Well, sorry, Martine. I'll focus on Africa because Martine will likely come from a South American perspective, which I think would be great. In Africa, sort of 2/3 of the population live off-grid, They live in rural areas, and the majority of their incomes come from farming. These are smallholder farmers that live on between 1 and 3 acres of land, and they make their money by either selling crops, selling animals, or selling byproducts of those animals. And all three of those things require water. And what most farmers in sub-Saharan Africa do is they either wait for the rain, which is unpredictable or unreliable, or they do what most of our customers do, is they take a bucket, they go over to their shallow hand-dug well, they put the bucket down there, they fill it up with 20 liters of water, which weighs 20 kgs or 45 pounds, or if any of you made it to the gym, it's those big weight plates at the gym, or if you remember a gym pre-coronavirus, it's those big weight plates at the gym. And often the woman of the household spends 3 to 4 hours every day physically using a pulley system to bring that water to the surface, to first meet her domestic needs and then meet her agriculture needs, which means she stays very unproductive. And that is the case for 94%, 95% of smallholder farmers in Africa. So very few farmers are using any means of irrigation in order to increase their yields, which means that their yields trail world averages by about 50%. You compare that to East Asia, where you have 47% of farms that are irrigated. So when you look at, sort of like you said, Emily, it's very nuanced and it's very regional specific. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have an economic water scarcity, not a physical water scarcity. In some parts of the world, we actually have a physical water scarcity that we need to be careful about. Central Asia is a great case study about this. In Africa, we have 660,000 cubic kilometers of water underground. It's a lot. Melvyn can probably correct me, but my back of the envelope math says that we can increase irrigation by about 20 times in Africa with the current water reserves. And this will be sort of changed based off of country. So when we talk about Africa, we need to think about water as a key source in improving the yield gap for that specific market.
I want to add, Emily, a little bit. Perhaps in Latin America or in South America, we are having more better rains. So we are having perhaps between 10 or 20% of our area under irrigation. And I would say where we have enough water for irrigation, it is very easy to cover that yield gap. The problem is where we do not have irrigation and it is rain fed. But then again, I think that improving soils, improving the way that we manage the crops, again, no tillage and all those things help us to improve yields, to reduce the yield gap using the rain that we have. Because with no tillage and improving soils and with all the residues covering the soil, we have better infiltration, we have more organic matter, we have more water storage inside the soil, and that improves our crops. We have better crops, better yields, and that it is again a virtuous circle. So that was what I want to add.
Great. And
okay, yeah, so I just wanted to be clear that I'm not trying to suggest that we don't need to improve yields. What I am trying to emphasize is just to think about our priorities in terms of how we use water. I really appreciate Melvin's point about the amount of water that's used for almond milk. That's one thing that is relatable for a lot of people. But if we look at some of the countries where I work and where Samir works, and what we'll see is particularly in the lean season, there's a heavy reliance on high calorie carbohydrates or grains. And there was one study some years back in Ghana that found particularly women along the coast relied a lot on raw sugarcane and maize because it was high calorie. But that's not a healthy diet. That's not dietary diversity. So as we're thinking about irrigating, there's a couple of things that we look at. One is profitability, of course. If farmers cannot get the revenue needed from adding the investment for irrigation, they're not going to invest. And it's very difficult to achieve the kinds of profits that are needed when you irrigate certain types of grains, especially maize, but others as well. And so if we're thinking about where to focus our investments, particularly development investments and subsidized investments and targeted investments, some of what we need to reconsider is nutritional security as we're looking at that. So not necessarily directing water to sugarcane or maize or rice, but thinking in terms of dietary diversity and how to increase access to healthy foods such as, vegetables, fruits, and to achieve that type of a balance through lean seasons, particularly the dry season when farmers are not able to irrigate or they're not able to necessarily grow vegetables or fruit during the dry seasons. So my emphasis in looking at issues around gender and inclusivity is looking at that nutritional element and how we think about where we allocate water in a basin, and whether or not we're allocating water, which is, we're looking at increasing pressure on water and soils. If we're looking at that and we're concerned about that, just trying to think about allocating water to crops that are more nutrition sensitive. And so that is some of the work that we've been looking at in certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not necessarily about being against raising yields or improving efficiency, but so much as how we allocate water across basins and whether or not we're doing that in a way that is nutrition sensitive.
Great, thank you all. And I think despite my best efforts to stir up some conflict by throwing out questions to all of you and saying some contentious things, getting some really strong agreement among all of you about these themes. So I know a number of you have touched on some of what I would kind of say solutions or ways forward in this space. And there have been suggestions both at the very local level to more broad scale instruments, thinking about things like finance, different market pressures, or regulation that we could consider. So I would like to ask you all about what we know about these methods and solutions, what are effective in terms of managing water for nutrition, for agricultural productivity, for economic benefit, keeping in mind some of these themes that we've already raised, in particular about women agriculturists with respect to some of these smaller smallholder farmers. I feel like I should ask again, but direct who is asking. But yeah, how should we be thinking about the solution space?
I'll take a start, and I'll try to add some contention just to make sure you're satisfied here. So I think that I mentioned this in my opening remarks. I think over the last decade, there's been last couple of decades, there's been a spray and pray approach when looking at the solution space, which means that there was lots of little chunks of money spread across many different types of prototyping or testing for solutions. And I think that was absolutely needed because we needed to figure out what worked. Prices have been changing so rapidly when it comes to solar and batteries and irrigation and fertilizer and logistics and the access to communication. I mean, things have changed so drastically, even over the last 8-9 years, that we had to do that. My view is that today, if we stopped all R&D, we have the right technology in order to create a food secure world. I'm not saying we should stop R&D, but I think that we have all of the technology available in the world, all of the resources available in the world, and we just have to put them together. So my view on the solution space is that we need to now think about how do we finance the solution space. And my view on this is that we need to choose, as a community, we need to choose like 5 solutions, or we need to choose a couple of solutions per region and funnel all of the money towards it so we start moving the needle. For example, because I know the irrigation space really well, we're looking at how solar irrigation subsidies can help reach food security. There's a lot of data around how this can work. My view would be for this, put $1 billion toward this. We need fewer sort of $10,000, $50,000, $100,000 grants or funding. We need sort of a couple of $1 billion put towards one solution in one region, and we need to do the same in multiple regions. And then after 5 years, once those solutions have been able to take off, we need to move it over. So I'm all about coordinating financing and using that as a lever point to actually start seeing some results in the space.
I'll go ahead and add something there. I don't disagree with Samir, even though he said he would try to throw out some things that were contentious. It's not so much contentious on my side. You know, as a project and as some of the research I'm involved in, we are also working on the solar irrigation solutions at household level. And a big part of that is the finance. And one of the things that I would just add here is the difference between regions. Conservation agriculture, so the no-till or low-till are things that we have tried in Africa. And it's not that they don't work, but the scale is very different. The same with center pivot. There are very few examples of successes in sub-Saharan Africa with center pivot. So while we may know from a scientific point of view that we can achieve certain efficiencies with that, it's a lot more difficult to achieve because of the size of the plots and because of how land is managed and owned and how users have rights to land in sub-Saharan Africa. So while those are important solutions and that those are contributing, so in certain regions, it's much more difficult in sub-Saharan Africa to make those work. And finance is part of that, but a lot of the other parts of it are things like land tenure, water rights, and how the collective action really around natural resources. So those makes it much more difficult to bring those in as solutions. And that's why looking at that smaller scale and the individual household level or plot level solutions are coming forward as areas for greater investment. And I think if there is a hot button issue here, it's around subsidies and whether or not countries will be allowed to subsidize and whether or not development investors will be comfortable with subsidies. From the research that we have done, we've seen a lot of positivity around subsidies, of creating market density, of creating the supply chains, of getting facilitating linkages between sectors. So some really important things can be achieved through subsidies, but it has been an area in development where there's been a lot of resistance, and it makes people very uncomfortable. And there's this idea that private sector would be very against subsidies and that it can distort markets, but sometimes it's needed as a crowding in effect and to create the kinds of market conditions that will, you know, really open up more opportunity for private sector. So I think that's been an issue that has probably been one of the bigger controversies, but has likely the greatest potential for creating solutions in some of the markets where we work.
And just to quickly add on that, I think, so just to share, because I think it'll help the conversation, we're working on, I think, the first large-scale solar irrigation subsidy with an African government right now. It's rolled out, systems are in the field. It's will probably be announced in the next month or so. And I hope this sort of serves as a proof point that this type of stuff works. And I think the challenge around this distributed solar irrigation stuff and a lot of these solutions is that just there wasn't a lot of data available. None of us, the implementers, had enough market share to actually have data that was statistically relevant for anyone. We put out an annual letter every year, and we're going to be, we've done a really big deep dive on some of the data that on our customers, sort of the most intense deep dive that we've done from an impact perspective. And we're hoping to publish a lot of our data just as a way to show that a solution can work. And I think that's been a big missing piece of this, is that the numbers just haven't been there previously for anyone to get behind sort of any solution. And I think that's starting to change now. So I think we'll start to see a shift in that. But I still think we need a lot more money going towards these solutions. So I'll keep saying that.
Go ahead, Melvyn.
It's difficult to know where to dip into this one because, you know, I've been involved recently with smallholder irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa, and I can see where Samir is coming from. But the irrigation bit is only one thing that's whirling around in a farmer's head. There are many, many other factors which actually are there rather than worrying too much about the water. It's important, but one of the solutions in Tanzania that's being exploited is to create markets for produce, in the sense that most of the push in sub-Saharan Africa has been to push yield increase. and it's stubbornly at 1 ton a hectare for basic cereals across the region. And it's been like that for the last 50 years. What they're looking at through AGRA is market pull. In other words, create the markets which don't exist like they do in other places in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is a growing urban population that wants a better quality food and so on. And they're aggregating farmers into groups, producer groups, and they're giving the money to the processors, not the farmers, the processors, to help the farmers to produce the quality and the timeliness of product to go into the supply chain. And that's where the subsidy comes in. And they're getting the product that they want, the processors, they're making money, they're pushing stuff out into the market, retailers are making money, and this means more money for farmers. Therefore, they want to invest and get things right. So they want to get the quality right, the yields right, and they see that water is part of that. And then they will sort of want to buy Samir's kit, I'm sure, to sort of make sure that that works. In other words, they're pulling farmers into the system rather than trying to push them from the bottom end, which I think was a lot of development in the past, you know, and it worked in some places, but not so often. And of course, the other end that I'm involved with at the moment is some of the big irrigation schemes in the Middle East, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, massive schemes, almost hydrological societies in themselves. And most of this is with flood irrigation. So we're looking at still about 90% of world irrigation with flood. And that's not going to change very much in our lifetimes, certainly not in mine. But you know, we have to make that work better. And the big question for me at the moment that I ask, which I never used to ask as a young lecturer because it seemed a simple question. We talked about flood irrigation wasting a lot of water. And we talked about 50% of the water we apply is lost. And we never at that point asked, where does this water go that we've lost? And now, because of water scarcity, people are beginning to ask that question. Okay, half my water that I put in my field is lost, but where's it gone? And in most cases, it's not disappeared at all. It's popping up somewhere else as a return flow for someone else. And so we have to take a more catchment view of water resources when we're dealing with the bigger irrigation schemes. And I can highlight a very famous scheme that I was reading about recently with Montana and Wyoming, which might strike a chord with students at Massachusetts in the Yellowstone Basin, where water was divided between Montana and Wyoming, and they were irrigating with it in the 1950s and so on. Then they ran into drought, and efficiencies were very poor, 65% efficiency of water use. So Wyoming invested in sprinklers and drip irrigation to improve their irrigation efficiency. And they did a good job. It went up to 90%. But what happened, of course, was the farmers downstream in Montana started to get upset because the amount of water available for them started to fall because the Wyoming farmers were not losing as much as they did in the past. And there was a big court case running for several years to resolve this matter. And the outcome was that Wyoming farmers were right to reclaim the water that they were losing and use it for themselves, much to the distress, as you can imagine, of Montana farmers who were suffering because they were of the lack of the return flows, if you see what I mean. And it's worth looking up that case. It's a fascinating case, and it just sets out the realities of irrigation and irrigation efficiencies and what they really mean for those studying irrigation. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit there, but
no, this has been great. I wanted to follow up on some of the things that all three of you have said in this, and pull a bit from a question that Sipra Wagner asked in our question and answer, which I think is centered on, we do have this long history that you all have been alluding to, where we've learned a lot both about irrigation and about what works in these different regions. And so the question then is, what have we learned from that? And in particular, are there lessons from some of these missteps that we're now able to kind of leapfrog and avoid moving forward, either in specific regions or globally.
I'll jump in. I think what we've learned in terms of some of the things that we're talking about is when you talk about subsidies, they need to be time bound. They need to be designed to protect your resources. We need to not market any systems that we use to be oversized. We need to be responsible in how we size systems. And we need to make sure that when we are deploying any sort of these systems, there's sort of a, we have to balance, and this is going to sound like very philosophical, but we have to balance speed with precision. And oftentimes, you know, some of the things we can do can get caught up in just development papers for decades, but there will be a point in which we just need to deploy stuff. And one of the things that I implore anyone on this call to do in the audience is I think there's a need when and the question that Zipporah Wagner asked, there's sort of a need to dig deeper into this, and the International Water Management Institute started writing reports on, you know, how much water can we extract in certain places without it being dangerous. And we need dozens of simulations run with different types of products saying, you know, X number of this types of water pumps and irrigation systems in this region can pull water for this many years without it becoming dangerous. So there's just a little exercise that's missing. And I think a lot of the focus, taking from the lessons from Central Asia and Latin America, I think we can start looking at, you know, what were the issues and what scared people, and how do we now acutely solve for what those issues were. And the issue was just not really recognizing where the limit was. We're very fortunate in Sub-Saharan Africa that our limit is very far, but there is, you know, their resources are limited, like Melvyn was saying, and we need to make sure that we are responsible in understanding where that limit is and what we can do to make sure that we are responsible with that limit.
Can I just add there that it's also lessons, but it's also tools and ways of deploying ICT. So there we now have tools that we can measure water moisture for at a very low cost. Many of which are Bluetooth, which can then be linked to the water accounting and other types of water allocation modeling and tools. So it is partly lessons, but it's also that we do have some tools at our disposal to be able to monitor water use in real time and to link into those bigger water accounting and other analytical methods that can enable us to monitor and manage as we go along, which didn't exist in previous decades.
I want to add, Emily, for me, efficiency in water use, it is very, very important because thinking in the past, all the water returns and all that may cause salinities, may cause troubles in the soils and in the soil management. I think for me, the soil, it is the cornerstone for all my production. Water also, but I begin with the soil. So for me, efficiency, it is very, very important, and that it is something that we learned in the past. I understand that it is not possible to have high efficiency systems all around the globe. In the beginning in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's difficult. What Nicole was saying, sure that it's going to be perhaps a solar pump, what it is doing Samir, and a very simple system because they have a less than an acre farm plot, the farmer. So we have to find and which they need, but trying to find the highest efficient systems that they can have, that they can buy. So I think that it is very, very important because of efficiency of water, more crop per drop, and also for the productivity and improvement of the soil. I think that the soils must be improving every year that we produce. We must have a better soil for the next year. That it is my target as a farmer or as an agronomist.
Great, and I think Martine, that really set up a question we just got from the audience, which is fundamentally about some of these linkages between these processes. So our question here is referencing some recent work by an MIT professor, Dara Antakabi, whose work has suggested a tipping point in crop productivity in sub-Saharan Africa, relating increased precipitation and nitrogen leaching. And the question asked about the linkage between water needs, fertilizer needs, and crop productivity.
How Melvyn has said before, as much water as you can use, as you have, more nitrogen and better yield. So mostly all the crops have a linear response to having more water, more evapotranspiration, and for that you also need all the nitrogen and all the fertilizers that you need for that you target. So it says, and in all those things, you have to balance the amount that you need of fertilizers and water, and with the yield that you are expecting. So I think that it is my comment on that.
And it does, as I mentioned, some of the tools that can be used to manage moisture and to ensure that you're not over irrigating. Some of the studies that we've done in Ethiopia have shown that using some soil moisture management tools enables farmers not to over irrigate and therefore reduces the nutrient leaching and nitrogen leaching. So there are tools available for this, and some of them are within the profitability band or could be packaged with irrigation solutions to help manage that water responsibly.
Melvyn, it looks like you may be trying to talk, but you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I'd clicked it. I was mindful of the comment that Umalele was making about Chevron's principle this morning for you, this afternoon for me, where it's that paradox where the more successful things become, the more difficult they become as well. And improving efficiency, adding fertilizer and so on, means that perhaps people are getting better yields and therefore they want to expand. And of course, that then leads to problems, and particularly with groundwater. And groundwater, people keep saying groundwater, there's a crisis coming in groundwater. It is already here. We are in a massive crisis on groundwater abstraction across the world. And goodness knows how you control it, because you have many millions of smallholders pumping away. And for a smallholder, groundwater is absolutely ideal. You just drill a hole where your farm is and you pump it. You don't have to wait for somebody else to supply it, which is often the problem of getting to the water. Once that water table starts to go down, of course, then you're in trouble. But how do you monitor it? How do you control water from millions of smallholders? They were going to tackle it in India, I think, but Uma didn't mention it. But can you imagine putting meters on all these pumps? And then are you going to charge for the water? How are you going to issue millions of small invoices and then have a massive army of people running around sort of collecting all the few small amounts of money? You know, it would cost a fortune. It just is not practical. So one has to find another means of managing the system on a catchment scale basis. And I think Tusha Shah came up with one where you control the electricity, particularly on the mainline pumps for electricity. So you shut the electricity down and they can't pump it. But then they bypass that and use the domestic lines to connect into the irrigation pumps, and they carry on. So it is administratively, it is a massive headache, but we're heading for real big problems with groundwater pumping. It's a shame really, because it is a wonderful resource. And maybe we ought to come to Samir's part of the world where there seems to be quite a massive reserve yet that's not touched.
I don't know if we're going to have any more room with the population growth. So it's going to be pretty difficult over there.
Yes, you're going to have your own problems, yes.
Yeah. Yes. One of the things that we do, and I know a number of other companies do, is you can actually monitor as a start when the static water level goes below your pump. So what we do is our pump shuts off, etc. But that sort of sensor mechanism from a smallholder level in mass can at least give some visibility of what's going on with the groundwater. And it's not the perfect solution, but I think that, you know, really low cost sensors on pumps is a part of the solution, at least from a visibility standpoint. How you solve it next, I don't know, but I can at least show you how you can see it.
Well, great. And I know we're running up against time here. Laura has told me we can steal a couple of minutes since we got started a little bit late. But I wanted to put out one kind of final question, which is, I think, especially in this last conversation, and often when we hear about water, we're talking about conflict about water and about, you know, whether it's between Montana and Wyoming or between smallholders using the same resource. So flipping that on its head, I wanted to ask all of you, what are the opportunities for cooperation that are promising and high leverage, whether it's between different sectors, between nations, between individuals, or other actors in this system?
Well, can I kick off? Cooperation is the name of the game at the moment. We have different games that have been played over the decades, and being someone of my age, you tend to have seen the games played many times. But cooperation, to me, is the only way in which we are going to resolve the trade-offs between the limited resources that we have. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals in the you know, the UN development agenda, focus on cooperation and integration. It's a big ask for people to cooperate when things are not bad. When they are bad, then people do get together. You see it with Corona. I mean, there's a massive international effort. It is absolutely amazing to watch what is happening in a crisis that we respond to. But for me, the big integrators are farmers. Every day, and Martin, perhaps you should be saying this, but you know, water is just one aspect of your thinking. You know, you're trying to work out the payments, the markets, employment laws, a whole bag of tricks. So every day, I see farmers here in the UK juggling with all kinds of issues, and they're integrating them within their heads on paper and spreadsheets and so on, and making their businesses work. And we've got to find a way of doing that a bit on a bigger scale, getting people working together. And a lot of it comes down to trust. And a person in the UK summed it up when they said, what we've got to do is to, in sort of internet terms, is to bring .com, the industries, .gov, the governments who like to regulate, the companies, the commercial companies want to make a profit, they like risk, so they can profit from it. Governments like to regulate, the .govs, and the .orgs, in other words, civil society, that we are very good at organizing ourselves into groups and pressure groups. But no one of those organizations, those three, could do the whole thing. But together, we can solve all these problems. And I'm very optimistic that we will feed ourselves by 2050. I might not be there, but I'm sure we'll succeed.
Well, great. Oh, Nicole?
Well, I was just going to add to that a lot of the research that's been done around water conflict actually shows that there's more cooperation than conflict. That because it is a finite resource, because it isn't, you know, you have to compromise, basically. You can't live without it. There has to be some type of compromise. So historically, we have cooperated over water more than we have fought over it. And that's something that is very hopeful. And I think that there is also a growing trend in some of the countries where they don't have the formal institutions that are part of government. They may exist on paper, but they don't exist in practice, and they certainly don't exist at local level. There's an increasing trend towards citizen science and involving communities and individuals within communities to begin to collect basic data and to understand the role of that data, what it actually means, how you use that data to manage your local water resources. So we do have some hopeful signs around water cooperation and the role that individuals can play in trying to gather whatever data is available and to try to manage their resources together.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your time and your thoughts and wisdom with us today. And thank you for humoring me and ending on this really fantastic, hopeful note, even after I tried to stir up some controversy and contention here. Laura, I'll turn it over to you with respect. I know we have some options for breakout rooms and next steps. But before I do that, again, I want to thank all of you in attendance for coming to this fantastic session. I know I learned a lot. I hope that you did as well. And again, a major thank you. And I'm sure you can't hear all of the applause that I'm sure we're all generating for sharing your time and thoughts with us on this really important topic. So thank you so much to our panelists as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that, that thank you, and thank you to you, Emily, as well for moderating. I thought it was a really important and informative discussion. So just, yeah, a big thank you again. We will now be having a 15-minute break, which will be followed by our second networking session. So if you'd like to continue the conversation from this panel or having any kind of technical difficulties, you can enter the Zoom break room that we have. So I'll put that in the chat now. And so panelists, we more than welcome you to join this session to continue the discussion with some of the interested participants if you're available. And then I just wanted to add also that we will have our kickoff event for the Water Innovation Prize today at 4 p.m. So that's a startup competition focused on water innovation that awards up to $35,000 in innovation grants annually to student-led teams. So the kickoff event, again, will be at 4 p.m. today. And if you're interested in attending, you can visit mitwaterinnovation.org to check that out. So we'll get started now with the 15-ish minute, a little less 10-minute break. And you can follow on with that Zoom break room, which is in the chat. And then I will also put the virtual networking session link in the chat. So that will start at 2:15. Thank you all so much.
So
Great,
are we
thank
still
you
live?
so much, Laura, for organizing this.
Yeah.